My God, we thank you for this day that we get to walk through your scriptures. We pray as we walk through the book of Deuteronomy, we may come to know you more, and that your words and your laws will come to life in our own lives. Amen.
Amen.
So for our friends that are newer, so Susan and Bobby, okay, so there's been a group of us here at this church that for almost 2 years, I thought it was a few months, but no, it's been almost 2 years, have been journeying through the Bible together. So we started in the book of Genesis, and it's kind of grown to more people and to more books. And so we're trying out an evening time slot. And so you are welcome to come any Thursday with us as we kind of journey through the book of Deuteronomy. And my promise is I will always try to make it interesting. And if you're more of a nerdy person, we'll cover nerdy topics. But if you're more of a devotional person, we will do that too. This is the reading schedule that we're going to follow. Except I got some of these dates in August wrong, so ignore those. But this is the schedule we're going to follow. This week, we're going to look at the first 4 chapters of Deuteronomy. And then next week, we are going to do the very end of chapter 4. But it's essentially chapters 5 through 11. And then on August 1st, we're going to do a special topic. And there is a group that meets on Thursday nights with the church. So we're always going to do a special topic the first Thursday of every month. And we're going to do a guide to the Gospels. And so that's a good night to maybe invite other people to come as well for that special topic. We'll learn about all the 4 Gospels of the Bible, how they relate, how they're different, and how to read kind of each one. So you can pick up each Matthew or Mark or Luke or John and know how to read it. And then we'll continue our way through the book of Deuteronomy. One of the things that we said last week, am I in the right presentation? I am. Cool. No, I'm not. Ignore this. I'm in next week's presentation. Don't look at this. You got to close your eyes. Oh, no. I must have been working on that upstairs and left it open. Oh, that's so embarrassing. I'm sorry, everybody.
Oh, Alexander, that's...
You get a preview to next week's, though. Okay. That might be why those dates were a little silly. Did you see it on the TV, Poppy?
It's on this TV.
Look at the other one behind you. Okay, there we go. Oh, I put the wrong window. I'm just losing my mind. I'm so sorry, everybody. This is...
Your daddy losing his mind today?
You don't want to read my notes that I have. Wow, this is not like me today. I'm just so sorry. This is like a bad week to come for the first time. What is this doing? Sorry, I'm going to just wait for a second. So, while I'm trying to pull this back up, thank you. Did anyone have a chance to read the first 4 chapters of Deuteronomy?
We read the first 2.
The first 2. Did anything stand out to you when you read it? And I'm going to assume it's maybe your first time reading Deuteronomy.
Good assumption.
Oh, yeah.
Was there anything that stood out to you while reading it?
Yes, but I didn't understand much about it.
That you didn't understand much about it? Was there any questions that rose up for you while reading it?
Well, it was instructive to me because it kind of helped me understand some of the things I know about the gospel, which I studied in the course.
Yeah. I feel like sometimes when we read some of these Old Testament texts, particularly ones we're unfamiliar with, it brings up a lot of questions a lot. Sometimes it brings up that familiarity. Oh, some of this sounds familiar, or I've seen it quoted, or it's the same topics repeated. Or we just get really lost and uncomfortable. And we're going to have some of those moments today. Okay, here's our schedule for where we're going to be. And then one of the things that we did last week was mention the books that have come before us. So each time we start a new book, I like to make a very little summary picture for it. And so the book of Exodus, we have a summary statement, which is, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt. If you could summarize the book of Deuteronomy, it could be that statement. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt. And that's essentially what happens in the first half of the book of Exodus. Israel is in Exodus. They're in slavery. They're in bondage. God calls them out. There is the 10 plagues, which is like this big battle of the gods. It's between Yahweh, Israel's God, and all of the Egyptian gods. And God rescues Israel out of Egypt. And the second half of the book, they go and they learn how to build a tabernacle, or a place for how you can worship God. But the question that you end the book of Exodus with is, how do we get inside the tabernacle? How do we worship God? And that's what the book of Leviticus is all about. If we were to summarize the book of Leviticus, we could say, be holy, for I, Yahweh, your God, am holy. And the book of Leviticus is this set of laws that teach and show you how to worship God and how to live a holy life. So now we have a tabernacle. We know how to go inside of it and how to worship. Now the question is, where do we go from here? And that's what the book of Numbers is all about. Numbers is when the group of Israel travels from Mount Sinai and they go up to the promised land. If we were to remember it in a phrase, it's rebellion in the wilderness. Because all throughout the book of Numbers, they keep messing up and God keeps forgiving them. And that's essentially Numbers in an overview. Any questions about those three books? Oh, great. Because that brings us to the book of Deuteronomy that we're going to be at today. Our summary statement from the book of Deuteronomy, we could say, is listen and love. And so this is a verse in Deuteronomy 6. We will read it next week. But it's, listen or hear, O Israel, Yahweh is our God. And you shall love Yahweh your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. That's kind of our summary statement for the book of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy is special because it is a retelling of the law that was already given in Exodus and Leviticus and in Numbers. Its name means second law, which you hear in the word Deuteronomy, like duo, two, and then nomos in Greek is law. And its Hebrew name is the words of Moses. And so, like we just said, it's kind of special because it is a retelling of all of the laws, but it's for a new generation. And so Deuteronomy actually looks a little bit different than the book of Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers. It tells these same laws in new ways. And so one question that we're going to ask ourselves when we read Numbers is, how might we retell the way that we live in God's world in our own generation or in our own life? And we are going to have an exercise a little bit later that we are going to take a law and kind of practice making it more practical into today's term. So I'm excited to show you that. The other part I want us to know about Deuteronomy is it's the final speeches of Moses before Israel enters the promised land. So Moses is not allowed to go into the promised land, and this is his parting words with all of Israel. Because of that, Deuteronomy is a very sacred book for Jews, because it's almost like your dad's on his deathbed, and it's like, what do I want you to know before I go on? And this is that final gift. And it's kind of laid out in 3 speeches. So chapters 1 through 11, we can summarize it with listen and love. Chapters 12 through 26 is the laws. Chapters 27 through 34 is the last, because I ran out of ways to alliterate it. But what is really special in that last section is this episode called the blessings and the curses. We talked about it a little bit last week, but it's like the end of the whole book. And they go up on a mountain, and it's, if you follow these laws in the covenant, you'll be blessed like this. And they go down and go up on another hill. If you don't, you will be cursed like this. And it's essentially what the whole book of Deuteronomy is leading to. Okay. Any questions on that? Great. You'll notice that I say author Deuteronomist. As a note, if you're newer to kind of an academic study or reading of Scripture, scholars will take the first 5 books of the Bible Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, and they will divide them up into different sources. Roughly, we call those the Deuteronomist, the priestly source, and the non-priestly sources. This has to do with these books are thousands of years of oral tradition, but they didn't get finalized and written down until after during and after the Babylonian exile. And so sometimes they're using original sources that kind of have different points of view. I bring that up for one reason, because the Deuteronomist source has a very different focus to the priestly source. And so if you've read Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, and then you read Deuteronomy, you might go, hey, these guys kind of have some different focuses. For an example, the Deuteronomist source that we're going to follow, that we're going to be reading through, has a beautiful outlook. And remember, this was written to a people in exile. They have no temple. They have no way of worshiping God. And so the authors of Deuteronomy, they don't want Israel going into these foreign temples to worship other gods. So they have a focus on how you worship God, and you do it in purity and no images. Don't use any physical things to make you think of God. And the way that they say you follow God is by following the law. So you could summarize their point of view. You are a child of God, and anyone can be a child of God because anyone can follow the laws of God. And that's a very beautiful statement. The priestly source has a different focus, and they say you're a child of God because God chose you, and there's nothing you can do about it. And so there's a little bit of a different focus. One of them is you are a child of God because you follow the laws of God. One of them is you're a child of God because God chose you, and there's nothing you can do about it. A little bit different hint. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yeah. I've heard that there are some people who believe in predestination.
Yeah. You could almost say, like, in the same way like Christians have lots of points of view on like free will versus predestination or election, we see those same different points of view even in the Old Testament. And so it's almost like we are people trying to grasp a big God that none of us can understand. And so we're seeing different points of view. You grew up, how did you grow up?
Lutheran.
Lutheran. Okay, all right.
Conservative Lutheran.
Oh, that's right, because
They
you
were
were
not,
Wisconsin.
they didn't believe in predestination. But I heard people tell about other churches who believe.
Yeah. Did anyone here grow up Presbyterian or Reformed?
I went to Presbyterian college.
Is Maryville Presbyterian?
Yes.
Okay.
They're the frozen chosen.
That's what they use that term.
Frozen
For
chosen.
Presbyterians.
That's funny.
But they self-refer as that.
Yeah.
Because they believe in predestination.
So well, we even get those different points of view way back in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. So, you know, we've always been asking.
Vaughn's not really sure what predestination is. Did you tell her?
I think Alexander should. I don't want to.
Generally, predestination is God orchestrates events and works in life. And so we fall into those. Sometimes people talk about it to say that they are like saved or predestined to be saved in like very concrete terms. Yeah. Although generally election refers to people, predestination to stuff or events. Nobody. Woohoo. Okay. If you're really curious about these different sources, we are not going to watch this video in here, but I got a lot of questions from people last week. So I have a link to a video that's going to talk about some of the different layers that make up those different books. Here's Deuteronomy. It's all blue because it's the Deuteronomist. And I have timestamps for what I think would be relevant for people to watch. This video is already linked up on the website, and I will send this out tonight to everyone if I have your email, so you can go back and watch it. With that, there's also this slide. We looked at this last week. So here's your non-priestly sources, your priestly source, and the Deuteronomist. I want to point this out because here's Deuteronomy in blue, and you'll notice that Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, or 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings are all from the Deuteronomist perspective. And so they kind of go together as a literary unit. And the only other thing that might be important if you care about different sources is the book of Deuteronomy actually came before, it was written before Genesis or Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. And so you might be curious to know that.
Say that very last thing again.
Deuteronomy was actually written down first, before Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. So it's the older source tradition. And one last little bit, if you're really curious, here is a layout of some of the different books of the Bible. I had this last week, and some people asked for it. Did you ask for one of these?
I don't know, but I'll take one.
Here we go. I don't know if anyone would want this. It's like your helpful Bible guide. And so J, E, D, and P, that goes to Torah. Those are the first 5 books of the Bible. I like this chart because it groups things together. And I just want to point out that, look, there's Jeremiah over here in the same box as Deuteronomy. You might be familiar with Jeremiah because it's one of the most popular prophets in the Bible. And a lot of the content and the themes and the theology in Jeremiah and Deuteronomy are very much the same. Any questions on that part? Great. We're not really going to look at this slide, but I made a very long slide in case people had questions. How do we know about all those sources? Well, there's all these differences like linguistic and terminology, and I have examples of them, but we won't look at those. This comes from a book, The Bible, The Sources Revealed by Richard Friedman. Each of these sections is a different chapter of his book, and I condensed it down in case people do have questions. We could look at it. But yeah, we don't, so that's okay. All right. Are y'all ready to take off our scholar hats and actually look at the text? Me too. Just as a reminder, here's our book of Deuteronomy with our outline. So we kind of roughly break it up into 3 parts. Chapters 1 through 11, which is that first speech from Moses, listen and love. Chapters 12 through 26, all of the laws. And then chapters 27 through 34, that last part. That includes the blessings and the curses. Again, we watched a video on this last week that I will send out again for those that are new if you want to watch it. And before we go through and kind of break down the text, I just want to give you the reminder about wrestling with God. Sometimes when we read these old scriptures, especially here in Deuteronomy, that talk about conquest, it can make us uncomfortable. And so we shared this story last week, and I told you this story about where Israel or Jacob wrestled with God and walked away blessed. And that became a way a lot of Jews think about reading scripture, is that it's this invitation to wrestle with God. And it might be uncomfortable, but just like Jacob or like Israel, we'll walk away blessed. And so if you come to a text that makes you uncomfortable, think of it as an opportunity to wrestle and to grow. Great. Let's look at the first 4 chapters. Anytime that we will come to a new section, I will send out in advance an outline of those chapters with essentially a sentence summarizing what happens in each chapter. So chapter 1 is going to be Moses' farewell address and warnings from history. He's going to go back through all of the journey that Israel has been on so far in their history. That is going to look like their journey around their neighbors, and we're going to show this on a map around Edom and Moab and Ammon. It's also going to look like ending up in 2 battles. So we're going to read about that in chapters 2 and 3. And then this section is going to end with chapter 4 about this warning against idolatry, which the book of Deuteronomy is very, very focused on. Make sure you worship God and worship God very purely. Before we look at the map, I want to take a zoomed out look, just so you know, in case you're unfamiliar with the ancient world. Here's Egypt, which is where Egypt is today. Here's Mesopotamia. There were 2 ancient empires, Assyria and Babylon, and smack dab in the middle is Israel. And so Israel was in these big crossroads in between Egypt and Babylon. And the story of the Bible begins when there is Abraham up in Ur, which is up here in Mesopotamia. And he says, I'm calling you, this is in Genesis 12, to become a new nation, to be a great father, and to go into this new land, and you'll be a blessing for all people. And so Abraham travels down into this promised land and journeys around here. His grandson, Jacob, his grandson's family ends up in Egypt. That's the story of Joseph, who is the son of Jacob, or Israel. And then that's where the book of Exodus picks up. They're in Egypt. They're called out of Egypt. They go to Mount Sinai. And I'm going to show this on this map. Here they are in Egypt. They go to Mount Sinai in the book of Exodus. The book of Leviticus takes place right on Mount Sinai. It's like one speech from God. The book of Numbers is then going from Sinai up to the Promised Land. And then there we are in the book of Deuteronomy, where they sort of repeat all of that. Now, I have a question for you all. Do you really care about maps and what happens in places?
I think it's helpful.
Okay, because I say that because I'm going to pass it around too. Actually, I'm going to pass around 2 maps. This is a more detailed map, and it's from the book of Exodus, so it lists some different places. From the book of Numbers. I'm also going to pass around, and I'll do it from the other side, a smaller map, and this is a map from the book of Deuteronomy. They mention different places, is why there's 2 different maps. If you would like, I can pull up this slide and we can mention all of the places that are named in these first 4 chapters. And it will only take about 4 minutes, but I can tell you what happened in those places.
I would love that.
Okay, all right. So this is the second sheet. It has it numbered. I put it all up in the PowerPoint as well. So you're not missing it if you don't have that map.
Yeah, okay.
So it begins in Egypt. Egypt is where Israel was in captivity. That's where the 10 plagues happened. And this is where God rescues Israel out of Egypt. And just if you're curious, so the 10 plagues match up to 10 of the different Egyptian gods. And so earlier I said it's like a battle of the gods, because it was Yahweh showing the whole world, look how powerful and great I am. We just took on the biggest nation of the world, which at that time would have been Egypt. And so it's this great, successful story. Look what all of Israel's God can do. And you think Israel would be like, great, we're going to follow God all the way because he's so powerful. And they mess up a lot. And that's what we're going to see their journey about. They leave Egypt, and number 2 on the map is Sinai or Horeb. These are 2 words that mean the same place, we think. It's the same mountain. Mount Sinai, Mount Horeb, the mountain of God. And this is where they're giving the 10 commandments. In Hebrew, the word commandment is Torah. It's more like words. And so a lot of times people will say 10 words or Decalogue, which is what I will say for 10 commandments. It's the Decalogue, the 10 words. We'll talk more about that later. So then they go on this 11-day journey. And just so you know, this takes about 1 month to go to here. They're here for about a year, and all of this is 38 years in that journey. They're 40 years in the wilderness. And so in that 38 years happens in the book of Numbers. So they go to Ezion Geber, and so this is the road to Mount Seir. And this is where they are going to get the instructions to go through in battle and to conquer the land of Canaan, essentially is what happens there. Then they go to Kadesh Barnea. Next week, when we look at this, we're going to take another look at some of the names that happened here, because this is one of those names that's the land of burning, which we'll talk about next week. But here, they send out the 12 spies into the land of Canaan. And so if you remember, there's 12 tribes of Israel, so 12 is important. They send 12 spies up into the land to see if they should go and live there. 10 of them come back, and they actually make up lies. And they say, we can't go there. It's a horrible place. And so only 2 say they should, Joshua and Jacob. And so all of Israel, that whole generation, dies off. Everyone except Joshua and Joshua and Caleb. They are the only ones from that older generation that are going to enter the promised land, because they were the only ones who were faithful to God.
Oh.
Yeah.
So they
said we should go.
They went to Canaan, or they scoped out Canaan.
Yes, yeah.
And then they said they came back and they told everyone else to go, and everyone else was like, no, we're not going.
Correct,
oh, but the 10 people lied and said it was
So
bad.
there was 12. 10 said don't go, 2 said do go.
Oh.
and then all of Israel listened to the 10. And Jacob
Okay.
and Joshua and Caleb, I don't know why I keep saying Jacob. Joshua and Caleb were like, please, God has our back. Look what God did in Egypt.
Okay.
And no one listened.
Okay.
And so they get punished. So then we're going to move on to number 5. They have their first battle with the Amorites. Number 6, they are on another road. And we're just going to summarize all of this by saying there are 3 people groups that are cousins to the Israelites. The Edomites, the Moabites, and the Ammonites. And we're just going to skip through all of these to say they walked around them peaceably, and we're supposed to leave them alone because they were their cousins. They're not bad in the story. But there's
That was interesting. It was just, you walked around them because they're cousins. They're okay.
Yes, they are part of God's extended family.
I was thinking here God was saying, you better not take them on. They'll beat you.
You know, there is this idea that God says to Israel, says, you are my favorite people of anyone. And anyone that you take on, I will be there with if you follow my laws. But earlier in the biblical text, like in Genesis, God already had covenants with the Moabites and the Edomites. The Edomites are the children of Esau. The Moabites and the Ammonites are the children of Lot, who are, Abraham's cousin. And so they already had covenants with Yahweh, which is why Yahweh says, look, just go around them because I already made promises to them. But you're my favorite, and I don't want to have to pick between my favorite kids. It's kind of like the idea here. Not all of them are their friends, though, and we're going to see in Heshbon and Bashan, there are these 2 battles that they're going to go through. We're going to look at those in just another slide. And then I'll just draw your attention to the last place. Number 13, you can see another little mountain right there, Mount Nebo. Mount Nebo is special because it's where Moses goes up before he dies, and it's kind of this bittersweet moment when you read it. He goes up on the mountain, and he looks out over all of the promised land, and essentially he's an old man that's crying and begging God, let me go, let me go. And God's like, you can't go because what you did has repercussions, but you can see it. And then Moses dies. And that's where the book of Deuteronomy ends. So that's the history. Does that make sense? Are you glad we walked through that?
Yes.
Do you feel more confused or more more clear?
It's not clear, but it took care of some of the things.
Okay, next week we're going to go back and touch on some of the highlights and talked about the places they rebelled, but they're not mentioned yet. These are like the good spots, essentially. Next week we're going to see the bad spots. Let's look through chapter 1. So those first 8 verses, it's recalling what happened on Mount Horeb or Mount Sinai. In Deuteronomy, they call it Mount Horeb, not Mount Sinai. It's the same place. And also we're going to see this appointment of different tribal leaders. You may remember this back in the book of Exodus and later in the book of Numbers. Moses has a father-in-law named Jethro. And before they get to Mount Sinai, they've just left Egypt. And Moses is like, I am so overwhelmed because there's all of these people with all of these problems and I can't handle it all. And so Jethro is like, hey, listen to an old man. I know more than you. Set up judges and kind of divide them into smaller people groups. We get a retelling of that story here. And so now this is after Mount Sinai. It's right before they go onto the conquest. And they set up all these different tribal leaders and judges. But here in Deuteronomy, they're serving more of a militaristic purpose instead of a conciliatory kind of purpose. This also is going to retell us that story again, as we talked about, where Israel sends these spies, these scouts ahead into the land, and the people are going to refuse. And again, their punishment for that is that they do not get to enter the promised land. That's chapter 1 in a summary. Does that make sense for the content for it? Okay, what we're going to do in this class, after we cover the content, we are going to look at a devotional point that we could learn. And so here is our devotional point for Deuteronomy chapter 1. We're going to summarize it with following God in the wilderness. So oftentimes, the wilderness is talked about as a picture for our lives and for Israel's life. So the wilderness journey symbolizes the Christian life, a journey of faith, challenges, and growth. The Israelites' mistakes serve as cautionary tales, reminding us to trust and obey God even when the path seems long and difficult. When we go back and we read these stories, we can sometimes think, what's the point? But the point is because all of us have stories and all of us has journeys, and they're not always easy. And so there's this power in reminding ourselves that sometimes I might feel like I'm in the wilderness, I'm lost, I don't have a lot of food to eat, it's just this weird manna stuff. But remember, God is there with you, and God's taking you somewhere. And that's one thing we can learn when we look at this. The other thing we can learn is that there are new words or new laws for a new generation. So Torah, or law, it literally means words or guiding post. In case you're curious on that, in the ancient world, they don't have sidewalks. And so when you're walking around in a desert to figure out where you're going to go, they would have these big posts, these guiding posts. Usually those posts would have the laws written on them. The kind of the laws of the land, they'd have the name of the king. And that's how you knew where to go. That's the word used for the commandments of God, the words of God. It's the guiding post to get you through life, through the wilderness. And so the other thing to know is that these laws, they're never fixed. So their intention is to lead us to God, and we can summarize them up in those two commandments: listen and love. And when you love God and love others. Love God, love others, listen to God. So one question we're going to ask ourselves in this class is, how might you re-experience or speak new words for the law in your own generation or life and community? That's what the book of Deuteronomy does. It takes these old laws, retells them in a new way. And so we're going to do an exercise where we're going to practice that. Okay, I put 2 verses here. And what we're going to do is pick one of the verses, and we're going to read it. Then we're going to ask, how would I summarize that? What is the main point? You could maybe even ask, is this more connected to loving God or loving people? If that's easier. And then we're going to try and apply it today. So the first verse, Deuteronomy 22:8, when you build a new house, you shall make a parapet, which is a small wall for your roof. Otherwise, you might have blood guilt on your house if anyone should fall from it. That's the easy verse. The next verse is Deuteronomy 22:5. A woman shall not wear a man's apparel, nor shall a man put on a woman's garment, for whoever does such thing is abhorrent to the Lord your God. My ask of you is to pick one of these verses. We're going to take about 2 minutes to look at it and dwell on it, and you can do that with yourself or with a group. And again, ask, what is the main point of this? How does it connect to loving God or loving others? And what would be a modern way of applying that? So with that, your 2 minutes begins now.
Which one do you want to do? Let's just do the top one. What do you think? How do you apply that to the modern tomorrow? Make a small, so put a small long, otherwise you're going to have to build a house with a huge problem. Yeah, because they Oh.
We'll have about 1 more minute.
No, that's a good perspective. Have a small, okay.
That's just a symbol of something else.
So you're saying the wall is strength?
And we'll do about 30 more seconds.
But it's on the roof. I don't know.
What period of time was Deuteronomy?
So it was written in the 6th and 5th century BCE, which is after the Babylonian exile, but it's recalling stuff from 14 to 1200 BCE, which is,
I think it
about
means you
1,000
should have
years before.
insurance. I mean, not necessarily
In other,
Not all
like, it
insurance,
is
but-
telling stories about the Bronze Age,
a backup.
but it's written down by the Iron Age, which the Iron Age has city dwellers, the Bronze Age has hunter-gatherers. So, I don't know if that helps you place it in history more.
As a reader of that,
Well, there's the thing about this is that there's no right or wrong.
something that was followed in the 6th century BC or whatever.
These things, yes, yeah, this was, and by when this is written, these are legal. Like,
Other legal.
yeah, this is the religious law and the like government law of the land. Okay, how was that as an exercise? Fun, uncomfortable, weird?
It was difficult to contextualize it in today's world for me.
Yes, it can be. Yeah. Which one did you do?
The first one.
You okay? Oh, y'all did the easy one. What did you do?
Like I said,
Oh, the second one. Great. Okay, so we'll start with that first one. This one was the more easier one. What would you say is the summary of this law, or what's the core of it?
Well, I don't know. I related it like you should have protection on your roof. You should build a wall so that, it's like this. You know how in the national parks they're like, they put a railing or a fence or something, and they're like, don't step out over this way or you might fall down the mountain, right?
Yeah.
Like, my thing was like, oh, you should have protection, like insurance of some kind, in case the person who falls off your roof sues you.
Yeah. That was actually the example I gave. I got hit by someone that was uninsured and had no license.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was a learning experience.
But then my mom said strength, and I was like, actually, that makes sense. Like fortitude, so that when someone falls off of your house, theoretically, like, you can handle it.
Okay. Lots of different ways of applying it. I like that. We're going to break these down in a moment, but I want to hear what you said or thought about the second one, which was the hard one, which more people in the first class, I think over 12 picked that one.
That's what they said about it, because, no, go ahead.
no, more of a pick the second one.
Yes, yeah. What would you say is the core in that law?
I'm trying to look for symbolic meanings as opposed to literal meaning.
Yeah.
It doesn't apply today.
So one of the things I'm going to encourage you, each law we look at, we'll say can apply today if we apply it at its core. And so let's break that up for just a moment. Let's take that first one. So when you build a house, you'll make a parapet around it. So in ancient Israelite society, houses often had flat roofs. They were used as living spaces. There's no AC. It could get very hot, so you would go outside. It's like your back porch. A parapet was a low protective wall, and it was required by law to prevent people from accidentally falling off the roof, especially if they drank too much wine and you don't have lights. You probably fall off roofs. So this was a commandment that was practical to ensure safety and prevent unnecessary accidents. If we were to summarize this at its core, it's care for others, be proactive and protective. A couple of different ways you could apply it. So for yourself, maybe reflect on your responsibility to ensure the safety and well-being of others. This commandment encourages you to be taking proactive measures to protect those who come into your home or under your care. I'll say one way that looks like for us, Rachel has 2 siblings in wheelchairs, and so when we picked the house that we have, we wanted somewhere that was wheelchair accessible because probably wouldn't be good if I tried to build a ramp with old people. You can also reflect on your responsibility to ensure the safety and well-being of others. Oh, that's the same line, sorry. This commandment embodies the principle of loving your neighbor as yourself. By taking steps to protect others, you are showing care and consideration for the lives and well-being of others. And lastly, you can reflect on how you are actually accountable for the safety and security of those around you. Maybe you can ensure safe conditions in your workplace or schools, public spaces, or just other places around you, having a culture of care and responsibility for others. Lots of different ways. I like the ideas too, thinking about a national park, or even that inner strength that you have of being ready for anything that comes your way. Now, the next verse is a little bit harder, we'll say, because it's a little bit more out of our context. So in ancient Israelite society, Clothing was a significant marker of identity, including gender identity. And this commandment was very likely aimed to maintain clear, distinct roles between male and female roles. And in the ancient world, secure family structures were seen as like the basis for society. And if your family structure broke apart, your society would break apart. And so it may have also been intended to avoid certain pagan rituals, like different sex practices. And so there's a focus on keeping these distinct things very clear. Now, the way you could maybe apply that today, reflect on how this commandment underscores the importance of being true to one's identity and the roles we are called to play in our lives. It encourages integrity and authenticity in our actions and appearances. I shared a story with the class earlier. So I grew up in a very fundamentalist and strict Christian world, and it was could be very harsh and very insular at times. And there came a point in my life where I was like, to follow God, I need to get out of this environment and move on somewhere else. Hi, Jim. Are you leaving?
You're by yourself now.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. And so for me to follow God meant to actually leave that community of the people of God that I had known my whole life, which was really scary for me. And for a lot of those people, including my own family, that meant not talking to me anymore and almost like disowning me. And for their point of view, they were like, how is this guy following God, running away from God? But for me to run to God, I had to get away from where I was. Sometimes to be true to where God's calling you, you have to go somewhere crazy. And that can include everything. Next part. Think about how the ancient Israelites understood divine order and distinctions God put in place. Today, we can reflect on respecting the divine order in our lives, recognizing and honoring the roles and responsibilities God has given us. If you're a parent, that's one of those things you might know, man, how do I be a parent and a worker and whatever else you do? Those things can conflict, and so being intentional about how you are responsible to where you are. Also, the last one, while maintaining respect for tradition, consider how to embrace inclusivity and support those who may not fit into traditional categories. This involves discerning the balance between upholding values, extending love, and acceptance to all individuals. We are not going to be this in-depth when we do these exercises. It'll be about a month from now when we get to those chapters, but this is just an example of what that might look like. There's lots of ways we can look at the core and find ways to kind of apply what these ancient laws might look like, but have a lot of value for us when we actually look at them. We're going to quickly cover some of these chapters. So chapter 2 is going to cover this journey around Edom and Moab and the Ammonites. And again, these are the distant kind of cousins of Israel, if you were. Yeah, I don't know. There's not much to say about that. God says avoid conflict and go around their lands, and they do that. Did anyone read? You said you read chapter 2. Did you get to the part about the giants and scary people and such? No. All right, cool. Don't worry about it. It's not there. So we'll just skip that. Okay. This chapter is going to end with meeting this new king, and we're going to look at it on the next slide, in Hebron. So they have two battles in Hebron and in Bashan. And these are not with distant cousins of Israel. These are with Canaanites. And there was this kind of ancient belief, you read about it in the flood narrative in Genesis 6 and in other parts of the Bible, that there were giants in the land and they were kind of half divine, half human. And we're going to meet them in this chapter. And we're going to look at a picture of them in a moment. Do what?
Weren't there giants?
That's what we read about here in Deuteronomy. I have a picture of one coming up here, so you'll see in a second. We're going to talk about that in just a second. But I want to just reflect on this idea about Moab and the Ammonites and the Edomites. And that's going to be our lesson for chapter 2, is God's big family. So Deuteronomy 2 lays out that there were previous promises and covenants God made with other people besides Israel. The Bible focuses on God working in this one family and this one people, Israel. But it references places and people that God is also working with. Here, we're seeing some of that extended family of God that's besides the family of Israel. And they're to avoid interfering with them. Here we see God's big family that may look or act different than us, but is still part of God's plan. I love that. When we look at the Bible, we really are looking in a microscope on one place that God is working. But there are lots of moments where God is working in other places and doing other things. One of my favorite is in the book of Acts. No, I think it might be in Luke. No, it is in Acts, where the prophets, there was a prophet going around. He's never heard of Jesus, and he's going and doing all these miracles and for God with the Holy Spirit. And the other apostles were like, just leave him be, because he's still doing the work of God. I love that part. Okay. No, any questions on that? Okay. Let's look at chapter 3, and coming back again to that end of chapter 2, because we're going to meet King Og of Bashan. I could not find a graphic that represented this one. I made this one for us a few weeks ago.
You made that?
I did, yeah. I spend too much time with graphics. I bought like 3 pictures for our presentation next week. I like good graphics. So this is Bashan, Og, king of Bashan. So the main thing that you'll know about him is he has this really big bed. And so if you kind of translate it into our measurements, it's like 6 feet by 13 feet. And he either had a really big bed because he was a really big guy, or because he had really big parties and needed more room in the bed, if you catch that drift. So, but what we kind of get is that he is this like half giant, half divine king. And it was a big deal for Israel to go to battle against King Og. So a lot of times throughout Scripture, there are references back to this story. So I hope that this picture just stands in your mind with this massive giant with his really big bed. The other part that we're going to see in this chapter, besides this defeat, is the allocation of the land for the tribes, which we're going to talk about in another slide in just a second, but also the instructions to cross the Jordan. And so Moses is going to encourage everyone, look, when you cross over the Jordan River, work together. And we're also going to see this scene where Moses is not allowed to enter into the promised land. And there it's sad. He's begging God that he can go and see it. God says no. And officially appoints Joshua as his successor. And so we're seeing this kind of transition in leadership. I want to just take a moment and tell you a little bit about how that laid out. This graphic's a little bit more confusing, so you can see it here a little more. There were 3 tribes, Reuben, Gad, and half of Manasseh, that conquered. These are the places that they conquered on this side of the Jordan. But this is not actually the promised land. The promised land is this side of the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. But they had already kind of conquered this land, and there was all these open spaces, and they had lots of sheep. And so they asked Moses, can we stay here and settle these lands? And it ended up becoming this big feud and argument, because all of the other tribes of Israel were like, hey, we're about to go to war and all die. And you guys are going to just stay over here? And so they come to this conclusion where they say, all right, this is what we're going to do. We're going to settle the land. We're going to fortify our cities, get our families established. And then they will come back over the Jordan and serve as the vanguard of the conquest. Do you know what the vanguard is? It's the very front of the military or of the battle. They're the very front lines, which means most of them will die. And so you see this kind of compromise that they make. And that's our takeaway for chapter 3, learning to work together. The accounts of the Transjordan tribes, those tribes that stayed on the other side of the Jordan, they retell that earlier story from Numbers 32, where those other tribes asked to stay behind. The result, again, they serve as the vanguard, and after establishing their cities for families and livestock. This chapter shows the importance of us working together. It shows how we can pursue our own individual desires with mutually beneficial outcomes. I love that about this story. Each of the tribes was able to pursue what was best for them, but they found a way to work it out that it was best for everyone. And that's a very good lesson that we can always learn in our lives. Any questions on that there in chapter 3?
So somebody's got to be out in front.
Somebody, yeah, that's true too. We don't like that one. Also, just remember King Og, the big guy with his big bed. And someone's got to be in the front. Now, chapter 4, I thought about us reading it, but we're not going to do that. We are just going to read 2 verses. And this part is going to cover a great commandment and some different warnings against idolatry. Do you know what a chiasm is? Or a chiastic structure? Have you heard that before? So, a chiasm? It's like
I think so.
it's a poetic structure. So in Hebrew, you can't underline things, you can't bold things or change the color. And so the way that they would make their poetry is formed around chiastic structures or repetition. And the way a chiasm works is it's like a pyramid. And so there's something that sets it off and things repeat. And in the middle is the focus. Sometimes these can be chapters long. Sometimes they can be a few words. Like a lot of the Psalms, 2 or 3 verses will make chiasms, or the whole psalm will be one big chiasm. The whole flood narrative, Genesis 6 through 9, is one big chiasm. In the middle is God loved people. It's really beautiful. But there is a chiasm that happens in chapter 4. And it begins and it ends with this call to obedience for the Israelites. There is then a description given of what it means to be obedient. Then there's a description of what it means to not be obedient. And the focus in the middle is about God versus other gods, or God versus idols. And so we're going to learn what it is to be obedient. When you're obedient to God, you remember the things God's done. You remember Yahweh, so that Yahweh is better than other gods. And you remember Israel's laws, or Israel's Torah. In contrast, when we're disobeying God, we tend to forget the things God has done. We tend to think about other gods and then the way other nations live. And so this is what we should do. Obey God by remembering, thinking about God, thinking about God's laws, and again, focusing on how our God is better than other gods. And I'm just going to read that call to obedience that the chapter begins with. So now, Israel, give heed to the statutes and ordinances that I am teaching you to observe, so that you may live and enter and occupy the land that your ancestors is giving you. You must neither add anything to what I command you or take away anything from it, but keep the commandments of the Lord your God, with which I am charging you. Yep. Any questions on that? Great. Let's walk through this little chapter. So this is, again, that call to obedience that we just read. And in the context of that other chiasm, remember these other parts. There is a reminder of the covenant at Sinai, or the covenant at Horeb. That is when God gives the 10 Commandments, the Decalogue, to Moses. I put this picture of God handing this to Moses here, is what this is, because next week we're going to tell the story about how those tablets got broken and Moses had to remake them. And so these first ones are special, though. God gives them directly to Moses. There's also this warning against idolatry. And so I put these stars here to remind me to check my notes. And my notes tell me to tell you that the Deuteronomy source does not like physical things. And my notes tell me to remind you that, remember, this is written when Israel is in exile. They don't have a temple to worship in. And so there's this very strong focus. You don't have to have a temple to worship God. You can worship God anywhere. And so you don't need anything or to be in any special place. You just need you in a pure heart. And you can find God anywhere that you are. This morning I found myself, before it was raining, out on my little swing bench outside, just listening to the birds. And God was there with me. And it wasn't in the church. It was crazy. So there's a warning, though, against idolatry. Don't let other things take you away from God. And if they start to, run away from those things. That also is going to bring us then to that reminder of God's holiness and God's greatness. We take the worship of God so serious because God is so important and so special. And then the chapter is going to end with this mention of the cities of refuge. And so essentially, the way in the ancient world, if I wronged Yvonne, say Yvonne broke my pen. This is my very special pen. I love this pen. And I was really mad. So I broke Yvonne's glasses. Well, now Yvonne can't see, so she tells Bill, and Bill comes and breaks my phone. And then I get mad, and so I go break your iPad, and then Bill burns my house down. So that is a way that vengeance would work. You can think about Romeo and Juliet. There's escalating tensions between families. And so there's this reminder in chapter 4 to something that is set up way back in the book of Numbers, which is, what do you do when someone kills someone either by mistake or on purpose? And they set up these cities of refuge. And there's 7 of them. 3 of them are east of the Jordan on the other side, and 4 of them are on the other parts of the land. But they were a way of limiting vengeance. And so if you shed blood on accident or on purpose, you could escape to that city. And then there was a designated avenger, essentially, from that family. And they were the only one that could go and get even with you by killing you. But if you went to a city, you could go and stand trial with witnesses. If they say you killed someone on purpose, then you would be put to death by that avenger. If you weren't, you were safe as long as you were in the city. And then when a new high priest came, you were set free. And you could start over. So, lesson 4 is going to teach us, or chapter 4 is going to teach us this other lesson about working together and about forgiveness. Cities of refuge balance justice and mercy with blood vengeance and family feuds. Anyone accused of murder could seek these cities and face a court with witnesses. In the case of manslaughter, only designated redeemers could seek vengeance. This system acknowledges human mistakes and the value of human life. And it foreshadows Christ being our own refuge from our own mistakes. This city of refuge system is really cool because even if you accidentally shed blood, it was still a big deal. You had to move and go live somewhere else. But it also provided protections against people making mistakes. And so it acknowledges both. Okay, that's the first 4 chapters of Deuteronomy. Any questions on that?
We need some of those cities of refuge.
We do need them. I think we actually have some of those in Europe that are refuge cities in some ways.
So you're saying that when it's the perpetrator that goes to the refuge, it's the perpetrator and the perpetrator's family that goes to the city of refuge, or is it the victim's family that goes?
So the perpetrator. So like if I accidentally ran over you and killed you,
yes,
and Susan was like coming after me because she was the avenger,
right?
I could flee to a refuge city.
Yes.
And be like, hey, that was a mistake. You know, she just jumped out in front of that road. And they would have a trial with at least 2 witnesses.
Right.
So it wasn't just he said, she said.
I see.
And I was safe. I'd be safe there.
Yes.
Forever.
Yes.
And then if there was a new high priest or a jubilee year, I would be set free and could go back.
So if there was a new high priest, you'd be set free.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And so, but until then, stay in the refuge city. If I went out of that refuge city, Susan could get me, you know.
Well, was there ever a new high priest and you weren't set free? Was his decision?
I think all of them, always his, and I think it was across the board. It reset everything.
It reset everything.
Yeah, and there was more also with Jubilee years, which was every seventh year, which would be the 50th year, they would reset the land boundaries as well. So your ancestral allotment in your tribes, like all of the clans had a certain amount of land to farm. In 49 years, other people could buy up more land, and they would reset it. It's kind of like a socialist system of keeping everything equal. Yeah, okay, that's not relevant to Deuteronomy.
I think instead of, to apply this concept of refuge cities to real life, well, not, the modern day, like, in terms of the criminal justice system, so many people that, allegedly commit a crime and then bond out of jail, like, there are so many things that can happen to those people, like, in that time where they're awaiting trial, right? Yeah. And, it's like, why do we... They should have a city of refuge, too, is what I'm saying, right? Because, like, we don't know if they... Like, the whole point of the justice system is that we don't know if they committed the crime or not, right? And so it's like, why would we either let them, like, sit in jail and potentially be, like, harmed, right? Or like have to go back out into their environment where, like, you know, this sort of violence exists today, like with gangs and stuff like that. I don't know. That's
one of the.
I feel like that's
pinnacles of-
definitely applicable to like modern day life.
And it's one of the pinnacles to kind of our justice system, that innocent until proven guilty,
Right.
which is you deserve a trial.
Yeah.
And that didn't always exist for people.
Right.
And so here we see God reaching out to the Israelites, being like, hey, let's calm it down a little bit.
Yeah.
And so learn some forgiveness, learn some space, which means sometimes the bad guy gets away with things,
Sure.
but it gives a chance for everyone to have space.
That never happens in our society.
Oh, never. Okay. There is another video that is about the book of Deuteronomy, but I'm not going to play it today. I ran out at the earlier session and today because we just have so many questions. So we will watch this at a later date. I want to just give you a heads up about next week. So we're going to cover the very end of chapter 4, but chapters 5 through 11. We have a lot of content to cover. I'm going to send out my outline for that, but I have like 63 slides, I think. And so we're going to kind of speed through some of the parts of next week, but we're not going to do review. And so my encouragement to you, though, is if you want to come next week, go ahead and read chapters 4 through 11, or 5 through 11. It'll be very fun and meaningful, and read chapter 9. Oh, also, chapter 7 has an uncomfortable text. I see I put a warning uncomfortable right there. So I forgot about that. I'm glad I put that in my notes. The Lord be with you.
Also with you.
My God, we thank you that we get to walk through your scriptures. We thank you that you are a God of mercy and of justice, a God of order and of new things. We pray that you speak into our lives, speak your words to us as a new people every day. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Alexander.
You said that you were going to send something out